Hello, everyone. My name is Professor Claus Yding Anderson. I'm from Denmark. I have been given the task of taking you through the basic principles of successful cryopreservation of human ovarian tissue. And as you may be aware of, we are having a huge program on cryopreservation of ovarian tissue in Denmark. And we have now produced a brand new video, which in detail will tell you how we actually do this procedure in Denmark. And at the end of my presentation, this will be played. So I do hope that you will stay on board for that long. The outline of my presentation is that I would like you to understand how freezing is actually working. What is the general aspects of this? And we have to use cryoprotectants. How do they work? And which cryoprotectants do we have at hand? And then I would like to go into the principles of slow freezing and vitrification and basically show you that at the end of the day, these two principles converge into the same technique. It's just the speed by which you do it. And then, of course, we have this continuous debate on whether we should slow freeze or vitrify human ovarian tissue. Let me give you my input on this. I think that this is probably too early to define yet. And then, as I said to you, we will end up by showing you a video of how we are doing this procedure in Denmark. So I'll try to blow the trumpet as good as I can and hope you'll stay on board. So the really fundamental factors for successful cryopreservation is very important to understand. There's actually three different things, and if you understand each one of them, you have actually made it quite some way in order to have successful cryopreservation. You are looking at ice crystal formation. So this is water. There's good and bad effects of ice crystals. You need both of them for cryopreservation. There's solution effects. So this is the cryoprotectants, this is the salts, this is the proteins, everything else than water, which is in the solution. And when you thaw out tissue, there's a risk of osmotic shock. Often, this is basically where it goes wrong when people are cryopreserving tissue. We need to look into this. And we use cryoprotectants, as you all are aware of, and this is in order to avoid cell damage. And we are also using cell-penetrating and non-penetrating substances. So sucrose is a non-penetrating substance. How does this work? I'll go into that. It's very important to understand that when we freeze, and especially in connection with slow freezing, there's a dual effect of ice. Of course, you all know that ice have a higher volume than water. And if we have ice crystals inside a cell, there's a huge risk that the expansion of the cell, of the crystal, the water crystal, will damage cell membrane. So we have to remove water from the cells. And we have to avoid that intercellular ice crystal is being performed. And on the other hand, it is also extremely important that we outside of the cell have ice crystals, because when ice turns into crystals, it reduces the activity of water, and thereby it actually redraws water further from the cells. So there is a dual effect of ice. No ice crystals inside the cell. We want them outside in order for water to be drawn out from the cells. And the solution effects, the proteins, the cryoprotectants, all the other salts and whatever is in there, it's very important to understand that when we do have ice crystal outside of the cells, outside of the tissue, it only contains water molecules. None of the proteins, none of the cryoprotectants, none of the salts go into these crystals. It's just pure water. And it's also important to notice that the water does not turn into ice all at once. There's pockets of liquid water still exist, even if you have ice crystals. And when you seed it, often you'll see that the ice crystal is only slowly growing. Even when it looks as if there's all crystals in the tube, there's still pockets of water. And therefore, this is a part of the process by which you draw water out of the cells. And the ice crystals do not contain salts or other substances, so they will remain in the remaining water. and thereby their concentration will, of course, be increasing. And this is the solution effects, that if we increase it too much, it may actually damage the cell. When we have cryoprotectants like DMSO or ethylene glycol in the solution, they freeze at a lot lower temperature than ice, so they remain in solution. But they concentrate then the salts and the proteins and the solutes, and they often come to very high concentrations in the remaining solution. And this may actually then have a negative effect on the cells. So this is how do we avoid these solution effects is something to understand. The osmotic shock, when we have thawed out the cell or the tissue, we have ice crystals outside of the cells and none inside. And when we thaw it out, then suddenly you may have a lot of ice crystals, a lot of water coming into solution very fast. This means that the osmotic pressure, the osmotic levels outside of the cells and tissue will become very low. And therefore, you will have a lot of water being sucked up by the cells very fast. And they may swell, and actually they may break if you don't control for this. So we need to thaw out the cells and tissue at an appropriate speed, by which we have water coming back to the cell at a speed that do not induce recrystallization, because this may happen if it's too slow, or if it's too fast, we may have osmotic swelling, and then the cell will break. So we have to optimize each one of those three parameters. If we look at the chemical structures of what we are dealing with, this is small organic molecules as propylene ethylene glycol, glycerol, or DMSO. And as you will see, they have hydrophilic groups here, and they have hydrophobic groups. So this is carbon atoms sitting here. And also for ethylene glycol, you have CH2 here, CH2 here. So these are lipophilic and these are hydrophilic. And this is what you need. You need substances which on one hand can penetrate the cell membrane because of the lipophilic structure, and then you need hydrophobic structures, and then you need lipophilic structures which can then bridge to the water bonds and make hydrogen bonds. And this is what the OH groups are doing. They go in and then they form up with water, and then they actually lower the freezing point this way, but they can prevent ice crystal formation if you have them in very high concentration, and then induce a glass-like vitrified state of water where it does not expand in volume. And this is vitrification. But this is when the organic molecules go in and separate the water molecules. And if you look at it, for instance, propylene glycol, it has a melting point of minus 59 degrees. The toxicity, of course, increases with concentration. 1.5 molar is what we normally use for slow freezing protocols. If we look at that, then there is one molecule of propanediol surrounded by 33 molecules of water. So obviously, the propanediol is not able to prevent ice crystal formation at that concentration. If we increase the concentration to 3 molar, then you have 14 molecules of water around each propanediol. If you increase it to 6 molar, then you have 1 in 5, and 44% of the volume is made up by propylene glycol. So at that high concentration, the water molecules are simply unable to find one another and build the crystal structure which make up the ice crystals. And then when you cool it off, you can have vitrification. But of course, the toxicity at 6 molar is considerable. So at this high concentration, it is really mandatory to have a very short exposure or a low temperature. Also, we normally use sucrose or trehalose, which are non-penetrating substances. Although sucrose is just made up of 2 different carbohydrates, they do not penetrate into the cell. So this means that they stay outside And they do the same thing as the cryoprotectants. They actually form hydrogen bonds with water. They stabilize the cell membranes, but they separate water molecules from one another, and therefore they actually reduce the risk by they reduce the water activity, and then they draw more water out of the cells. And this is another mechanism by which you can dehydrate the cell before it is actually being frozen. So the cryoprotectants are toxic. Their toxicity is dependent on the time that they are in contact with the cells, their concentration, and the temperature by which the cryoprotectants are exposed to the cells of the tissue. It do turn out that the metabolism is reduced by 50%. For every 10 degrees, we decrease the temperature, which means that if we go from 37 to 1 degree, we have really reduced the metabolism considerably, and therefore the cells are less vulnerable. What we also have to understand is that if we mix the cryoprotectants and keep the cells in contact while we mix the cryoprotectants, it actually may release in heat, just mixing the cryoprotectant. So we need to make all these solutions on beforehand, which is what we normally do. And you also have to understand that cryoprotectant solutions, they may be hypertonic. So if they have too high an osmotic pressure, they will draw water out, and this may not be the right way to do it, and it potentially could damage the cells. So time, concentration, and temperature are the really important factors in having successful cryopreservation. As short time as possible, a concentration which may be high, but then the time should be very low, and temperature, often if you cool it off, then you lower the metabolism and you have more tolerability. The cells are more tolerable to your cryoprotectants. When we look at human ovarian tissue, you can see this on the right-hand side here. This is the ovarian surface epithelium. Each one of those red dots are primordial follicles. So you can see that right under the surface of human ovarian tissue, you have a large amount of follicles. Each one of these have the capacity to develop to the preovulatory follicle and maintain organ function of an ovary for one cycle. The concentration disappears as you enter towards the medulla. But of course, this is an extremely heterogeneous tissue. You have the surface epithelium, you have the cortex, you have part of the medulla here, and it's very difficult to sit at your desk and then determine which protocol will be really good for this type of tissue, because the diffusion constants of your cryoprotectant through this layer, through this layer, through this layer may be completely different. And we only want to expose this middle primordial follicle for so long time that we raise the concentration of cryoprotectants to what we want, and not more than that. And this is basically impossible to calculate. So this is empirical, the methods that we use for freezing ovarian tissue. We cannot determine how this will happen. So there's been a lot of studies going on to figure out which is the protocol which is most effective in freezing ovarian tissue. And of course, the question which is often asked is, should we starting this program now, should we do slow freezing or vitrification? Which is the better? And basically, there's nobody who's able to answer that question. And this is often we need to talk on how we actually determining this. In IVF setting, it would be pretty straightforward. If we do this, how many women become pregnant? And if we do that, how many women do become pregnant? But if we do this for ovarian tissue, we have to wait for a very long time. Of course, this is the right thing to determine the pregnancy rate of women. But when we do take out ovarian tissue from a woman, she will wait often to have a cancer treatment. This will mean that she will not come back to collect her tissue within 2, 3, 4, 5 years. On average, it's between 4 and 5 years. And then when the tissue is back, it takes a while for it to come on board and start working, and she may not become pregnant immediately. We have women who have become pregnant 5 years after we transplanted the tissue, which means that if you want to wait and calculate the pregnancy rate, you have to be very patient, and it takes a long time. And therefore, we don't have a very good estimate, at least in terms of pregnancy, whether slow freezing or vitrification is the better. There is then surrogate endpoints. How many follicles are available? What is the success for freezing the tissue? This should reflect the longevity of the tissue. So the longer it works, the more follicles which are available, the better it should work. You can also use follicle survival in immune deficient mice, morphology, expression of apoptotic markers, and hormone production, and different. You can use different species. But this is probably the last point here, which we have been using to develop the protocols we're using today, and this is surrogate endpoints. But it do work, but which one is the better is not possible to answer. The one we have developed in Denmark and which we use is the slow freezing protocol, where we use 1.5 molar ethylene glycol and 1.0.1 molar sucrose, and then human serum albumin 10 milligram per mil, which is also very important. So when we expose the tissue, the concentration of ethylene glycol is relatively low and relatively non-toxic. So we cool it off and get to -9, where we induce ice crystal formation. And at that point, we start to affect the tissue. But this is then already at -9. So the metabolic rate is very low. And the growing ice crystals, they exclude salts and solutes and gradually increase the concentration of cryoprotectant agent also in the intracellular space, because the cryoprotectants are capable of diffusing across the cell membrane. So it's actually the extracellular ice formation which draws out water outside of the cells, reduces water, which then slowly takes out water from the cell and thereby dehydrate it. And on the other hand, the cryoprotectants are then entering the cell. So the concentrations of cryoprotectant inside the cell keeps increasing during this process. And this usually continues until -40. And at that point, you will, if you look at it, then you have a concentrations of ethylene glycol within the cells of around 6 molar. So we reach the same point as we do immediately when we do vitrification. And at that point, we can actually plunge it directly into the liquid nitrogen. And this is what I've been trying to illustrate here. 6 molar, we have to do it very fast and cool it really fast in order to avoid ice crystal formation. You can schematically show it this way, that in vitrification, we put the tissue in very high concentration and it shrinks, and then we plunge it into liquid nitrogen, and then it remains viable. Whereas we in slow freezing slowly increases the intracellular concentration of cryoprotectants and reach around the same concentrations of cryoprotectant 6 molar at -40, at which point we can put it directly into liquid nitrogen. So basically, slow freezing and vitrification do the same thing, but at different speed and at different temperatures. In terms of efficacy, when we're looking at ovarian tissue, there's simply too few data on vitrification to draw any meaningful conclusion. So I cannot recommend either one of the methods for you. But what we can say is that if we look at the children which has been born from transplanting frozen thawed ovarian tissue on a worldwide basis, then we are now, this is 2017, so we are probably reaching around 200 babies at this point in time. And as far as I can see, we are having around 5 or 6 children which have been born as a result of tissue which were vitrified originally. So there's simply too few where the tissue has been vitrified. What we do know now is that if we look at the slow freezing, and Stine in our lab has been looking at that and using the same method as before with the vital stain of primordial follicles, and she has been looking at, so the vital red only stains viable follicles. So these are alive and are okay. And she has then looked at the number of follicles on histology and the number of follicles, which in that tissue was stained with neutral red. And there's a beautiful linear correlation. And you can see them sitting here, all the primordial follicles, again, here, the ovarian surface epithelium. So there's a lot of them sitting in there. This is the procedure that Stine uses to calculate the follicular survival using the neutral red method. She has tissue here. She chop it up on a chopper, put it into a solution with neutral red like this. And when it comes out, you can see here, all the red dots represent primordial follicles. She counts these, embedded in agar, have it serially sectioned, and count all the follicles histologically. And then you just divide the two numbers with one another, and there you can see you get around 80% here, and you have different pieces of tissue that you can do this with. And if we do this, then the fresh tissue contain around 91% of viable follicles, whereas the frozen thawed cortical tissue from slow freezing contain 84%. So there's a small reduction in viable follicles when we do slow freezing. And this is basically very good data for the slow freezing protocol, because it's not the freezing process which is damaging the pool of follicles. And here you can see this is time, and this is survival. And we have the longest, the tissue we have evaluated had been stored 18 years in liquid nitrogen, and basically this is the best survival of them all. So as soon as we have it in liquid nitrogen, we can store it for as long as we wish to. In Denmark, we have this program on cryopreservation of ovarian tissue, where we transport the tissue from centers in Denmark. You can see that we are up here in the world, and this is Europe. And then we get tissue from different centers. This is the way it's transported. And we have looked at the survival. So if we transport it between 4 and 5 hours, you can see that the survival is very good. There's no difference between transport and local hospital. So this is very good news for people who want to establish a centralized service. This is indeed feasible. So we actually now, for the first time, have available the tools to make a direct quantitative comparison between slow freezing and vitrification in terms of follicle survival. This has not yet been performed. We are doing a study in our laboratory at the moment, and we do hope that this will be finalized in quite soon. So we will have an answer which of the processes are providing the best survival. All right. We have those 5 cases of vitrification is free from Japan, with now Suzuki and Kawamura, where they have looked at this. This is the protocol they have used for vitrification. This is the protocol they have used for thawing out. And indeed, this is also feasible. You can do this, and you have surviving follicles which are able to result in a healthy baby. This is another one who has been doing vitrification is Sherman Silver from the US. The way that Sherman does it is that he takes off the cortical tissue here, puts in the 6 molar cryoprotectant here, and leave it there. And then when it goes to the bottom, it's equilibrated. Then he takes them out, and then he puts them on this copper grid, which is able to draw away heat very fast. And then when he have them positioned there, he can put this directly into liquid nitrogen. So this is the way that he is doing vitrification. I think that it is important to point out that 5 babies is not a lot. They have actually made a very nice study in Chardonnay and Marie-Madeleine Dolman's group on baboon ovarian tissue, which they vitrified, and they transplanted this back to the monkey where it was originating for 12 and 18 months. The ovulations was restored. The tissue came on board and did what it was supposed to do. But when we looked at whether any of these animals, although they were mated several times, there were no conceptions. So it do appear that it may actually turn out that at least in some circumstances, the vitrification is affecting the tissue in a way that it reduces the chance of conception. But this is something which we have to look more into. So what we end up at is this picture, which is now very old, from David Baer's group. This is sheep. But what we do see is that the fresh tissue, when you transplant it, there's only 35% which survives. Whether it's frozen thawed, it's 38. So these two figures are almost simultaneously. So it doesn't matter that we have actually frozen the tissue. It's almost the same as just putting it back. So it is important to start to look at how do we optimize the transplantation procedure. So in conclusion, I would like to state that I think a detailed understanding of cryobiology facilitates successful implementation of freezing procedures, and you need to look into this if you're going to do ovarian tissue. I think that if you look at slow freezing and vitrification, they both avoid intercellular ice crystal formation essentially by the same principle. Slow freezing, you build up the concentration of intercellular cryoprotectants, and vitrification, you do it on beforehand. The freezing speed is different. It really looks as if the slow freezing protocol have excellent follicle survival. And I think that the neutral red method is a method that each one of you can put on wherever you're sitting out there, and you have an estimate of what your follicle survival will be. I think that you also have to realize that when preparing ovarian tissue for freezing, this is completely different from what you're doing in the IVF laboratory. Anyway, if you're running an IVF clinic, and there have to be people who are specially dedicated to do this procedure and be expert in it. And I would like now to switch to the video that we have produced so that you have an opportunity to look at the procedure exactly as we do it. And this is both adult and children's ovaries. So please continue afterwards. Thank you for your attention.
Hello everyone. So with this video we will show you how we cryopreserve ovarian tissue in Denmark. And we are located at the Laboratory of Reproductive Biology in Denmark. We have been centralizing the ovarian tissue service here, and we're located at the University Hospital, which is the main hospital of Copenhagen. And here we are inviting you all inside to see how we do this. So this is just a short overview to show you the workflow, that this is the overall scheme. When we retrieve an ovary, we prepare the cortical tissue, and then we freeze these small pieces. And once the patient has survived her cancer and would like to have a fertility restored, we can thaw out the tissue and retransplant some of this tissue and give her a chance to mother a biological child. So in Denmark, we have centralized the service to our center in Copenhagen, and this is the best for the patients, which are in many cases very sick. So we will extract the ovary at the local hospital near the patient, and then we can transport the ovary on ice to our center in Copenhagen, and we retrieve ovaries from Aarhus and Odense and from southern Sweden, and then we also get it from the local hospital. So in cases where we retrieve the ovary from external hospitals, it's transported to us on ice, and it's delivered by a cargo company, and it normally takes a maximum of 6 hours to arrive to our laboratory. And then we go directly into the lab, and then we take out the ovary, and we see if there's still ice on the box in order to ensure that it has been kept cold during the whole transport. If we retrieve the ovary from the local hospital, we simply go to the operating theater with some warm media and then collect the tissue there directly. So once the ovary have arrived, then what? Then we have this working scheme in which we can put in all the data. We put in the date, the patient number, the name of the patient, all the identification. We also put in the referring hospital and doctor, the diagnosis, and then we put in all the morphological characteristics of the ovary, if we get a part of an ovary or a whole ovary, the volume. and whether or not there was ice on the transport and once it has arrived. And then for the preparation, we always put in who prepared the tissue and the number of pieces and the sizes. And then the bottom part here, this is where we note when we start the freezing. That's this first equilibration step, which is 30 minutes. And then we put in, again, the initials of the people responsible for this. And there's also the sealing and double sealing in the end, which we'll talk about later. We also put in how many tubes and how many pieces, the batch number for the medium, and then the localization, where do we put the samples afterwards. And then from the beginning, we start documenting just the overall appearance of the ovary. So we take pictures, and here you can see 3 examples, and then we also weigh the ovary. And here we have a small ovary from a little girl who have arrived, and then we simply take the ovary and then weigh it. And as you can see here, it's a very small ovary. This is an ovary from a 3-year-old girl. So in the meantime, we have prepared all of these things that we will use for the cryopreservation. So we have the isotonic saline that we'll use to prepare the tissue in. We have the scalpel, the forceps, the ethanol to disinfect, and then we have all our cryotubes, and then a little bit of fixative to take a little piece for histology. So I think the most important utensils for this is actually the blade, the knife that we use, and then these hooked forceps, because this ensures that you have a very good grip on the tissue when you make the preparation, and you can see this in the videos in a bit. And we only cryopreserve the cortical tissue because this is where we have 90% of the follicular reserve, and these are also the follicles which is small enough to actually survive the freezing and thawing. So this is the critical part, to isolate this cortical tissue. So here you can see how we are cutting the ovary into 2 halves, and this is an important piece, because if you do the halvening in 2 equal parts, then it's a little bit easier to prepare the ovary. And as you can see here, it's very nice to have 3 hands. So this is one reason why we are always 2 people to perform this procedure. One thing is, of course, the speed. We can do this faster if we're 2 people, but also to do the halvening of the ovary, it's a lot easier when you're 2 people. So this first video will show you how we prepare an adult ovary. And here you can see there's this thick medullary part that we need to remove to get to the cortex, and it's quite vascularized, which is giving it this red-pink color. So in the beginning, you would just try and cut away all of this medulla, and you can see the cutting technique here is that you're cutting into the tissue and then you're leveling off before you go into the cortex. And then we just cut away small pieces, and this procedure normally takes around 15 minutes. And here you can see we have played it forward, so now we are getting to this avascular cortex, where you can see it's all pale and all white, and it's because there's very few blood vessels in the cortex. And this is the reason why we can actually freeze the tissue and prepare the tissue, that the cortex is quite hard and fibrous. And then we can actually isolate it in this way. And here you can see we're then cutting it into smaller pieces. And we normally try and make 20 to 25 pieces to fit into 20 cryovials. But it of course depends on the size of the ovary. And then afterwards we line up the pieces, then we take a picture in order to document the size and the number of pieces. So little girls' ovaries, they're quite different. And you can see here from the histological picture behind that it's just all packed with follicles. This is from a 2-year-old, and you can see there's follicles everywhere. On the right side, you can see we have a 7-year-old that's a little more getting a defined cortex area, but there's still like lots of follicles which is not completely defined to the cortex. So these ovaries are prepared a little bit different. If we get a very small ovary without much medullary part, then we actually just cut it directly into sections of 2 millimeters. But if we can prepare it similar to the adult, then we actually try and do this. And here's the little ovary from the 3-year-old girl. And you can see it's a little thick on the middle there, so we are trying to open it up to cut out some of the medullary part. So here we are cutting it into 2 halves. You can see it's quite small. But it is very critical that we do get it isolated to around 2 millimeters to have an efficient freezing. So this is where we do choose to cut it into 2 halves and try and remove some of the medullary parts here. So what we often do with these little girls, that if we're able to isolate some of the medulla, then we also freeze the medullary pieces because they are just packed with follicles. So this is why I'm trying to cut them off in these thin sheets in order to also cryopreserve the medullary tissue. And here we are removing some connective tissues. But we are getting there. Here you can see one piece have been prepared. And then there's a little bit of medulla up here floating around. And then we're cutting away a little more of the connective tissue. And then finally, we are trying to cut away a little more of the medullary part here. So this is here another piece is coming off that we will also freeze. So now we are done. You can see here we have the cortex, and then we'll simply cut it into smaller pieces. So these pieces are, of course, a lot smaller than the ones we prepare for the adult ovaries, but again, these pieces are just packed with follicles. So here you can see we are putting a little piece aside, and we will take this for histology. So this is a routine that we always take a little bit of cortex for histology to see if the follicles look normal. So this is the final endpoint from an adult ovary. You can see how thin these pieces are, and this is the critical point to actually get an efficient freezing. So then we actually start the freezing, and we do this by putting the pieces of tissue into our freezing medium. So this is where we, on our cryo journal, note the starting time, because when we start the freezing, this is kind of an equilibration step, but also a step where we wash away the surplus media. And this has to be for 30 minutes on ice. Here you can see we put the tube on ice on a shaking table. You can see the pieces are moving inside, and has to be there for about 30 minutes. So the freezing solution. this is a homemade because there's no commercial available media, but it's quite simple. And we always make the stock solution where we prepare 800 milliliters of ethylene, 1.5 molar ethylene glycol combined with sucrose in PBS. And this stock solution have a shelf life of 3 months, and it's tested for endotoxins and sterility. And then on the day that we need to use the freezing media, then we take out the stock solution and then combine it with human serum albumin. So then we prepare around 50 milliliters per patient, and then we use this in the cryotubes and for the equilibration. And here you can see the cryotubes that we load with the freezing media, and then we have the color coding, we have the social security number of the patient, and also our specific lab number for this patient. And then we also now have a European code, the SEC code, which is a 20-digit number, which is also on these ampules. So here, after the 30 minutes, we take out the pieces and transfer them to these small cryotubes with the same freezing media. So normally we have 1 to 2 pieces of tissue per cryo vial. But in this case with the little girl here, you can see we just put 1 piece because she don't have that many pieces. Then we load the samples into our planner freezer, which we have programmed for the slow freezing protocol. And it's gonna start the program at -2, and then it goes to -9, where we will perform the manual seeding. So the manual seeding is necessary because this is where we induce the external ice crystal formation, and we do this with a cotton stick with a little bit of liquid nitrogen. And here you can see we got this cloudy ice crystal formation starting in the media. Then we put the ampules back in the planner freezer, and then the program will take the samples to -40 degrees with 0.3 degrees a minute. So this is the slow part of the freezing. And once we get to these -40, then we have the vitrified state of the freezing, and then the machine quickly takes the samples to around -140. After the freezing, then this is about 2 hours later, then we take the ampules and then we do a double sealing, because these tubes are going into liquid nitrogen for long time storage, and to avoid any potential contamination, then we do this CryoFlex double sealing of the samples before we put them into storage. So we have 5 big cryotanks in our lab, and we always ensure that we actually split the samples into 2 tanks, just in any case that any of the tanks, God forbid, should run out of liquid nitrogen or something will happen, then we still have half of the tissue in one of our other tanks, which is located in a different room. So we split we have 10 tubes in each tank, and here you can see the tubes going into the rack with the color coding, which makes it easier to locate when we need to find the tubes again. And then the rack is going back into storage. So then the tissue is left for long-term storage, and there's actually no limit for the storage time in Denmark. And because some of them are little girls, then the tissue might be lying there for 20 to 30 years. So if any of you are interested in learning this technique, then we do have a cryo ovary website that you can go to, and then you can actually go to us on a 3-day workshop if you want to learn this. We don't have workshop at the moment due to Corona, but hopefully next year our workshops will open up again, and then we will teach you everything, both the cryopreservation and the validation of the techniques. So thank you for now, and we do hope to see you in Copenhagen sometime. Thank you very much.